News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Apple tumbled after component shortages weighed on the company's sales forecast, signaling that industry-wide supply constraints are taking a bigger toll than expected. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow.
It came down to a really critical question, which is what does the world look like in 3 months relative to today? And Apple made some pretty stunning concessions that they'd misjudged demand on the smartphone side and on other products.
Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Apple shares nearly 10% lower. Amazon and Microsoft are showing their AI spending spree remains solid. Amazon boosted its forecast for full-year capital expenditures to $220 billion, most of that spending going toward AI. The outlook from Amazon and other hyperscalers, including Microsoft, shows there's no let-up in ambitions for building AI infrastructure. Microsoft's $450 billion jump just yesterday is the biggest in stock market history, adding nearly $500 billion to its value. Microsoft shares now 2.5% higher. Amazon shares have jumped 15%. Tech companies have been under some intense volatility after a massive run. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 now 0.25% higher, NASDAQ 0.3% higher, and the Dow about 0.4% higher. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.73% and the 2-year yield at 4.29%. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index is about 0.5% higher now, led by monolithic power, which has jumped nearly 9%. Oil is about 1% higher, WTI at $84 a barrel, Brent crude closing in on $90 a barrel. ExxonMobil and Chevron put their profits back into debt reduction rather than huge buyback increases because they don't know how long the war-driven price rallies will last. Bloomberg's Dan Curtis says Chevron saw record U.S. production,
offsetting a 10% decrease in international refining due to supply disruptions from the Iran war. It is part of a consortium exploring options for a new pipeline to the Mediterranean as an alternative to shipping through the Persian Gulf, so it's looking ahead on how to kind of counter some of that disruption.
Bloomberg's Dan Curtis. ExxonMobil shares about 2% lower and Chevron shares about 1% higher. Consumer sentiment rose to a 5-month high in July. The University of Michigan's final July sentiment index jumped to 55.2 with improvements in sentiment seen across income, age, education, and political parties. Director of Surveys Joanne Shu says sentiment is better now that we're past the initial shock of the Iran war with somewhat lower gas prices. Still, she says there is some frustration.
They remain just really frustrated by the persistence of high prices. We are really treading water at this point. Not as bad as a few months ago, but still not doing great either.
University of Michigan Director of Surveys Joanne Shu on Bloomberg Intelligence. 3 Federal Reserve policymakers say stubborn inflation drove their dissenting votes for higher interest rates this week. It's a sign of mounting internal pressure on Chairman Kevin Warsh to take action. Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack, Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari, and Dallas Fed President Lori Logan all expressed concerns that inflation may not be returning to the Fed's 2% target unless the central bank raises rates. Bloomberg's Michael McKee says Logan focused on, quote, modest action.
She doesn't talk about incrementalism, but she does talk about modest action on rates, saying inflation will not reach the 2% target without further tightening. Modest action in the near term would reduce the likelihood of needing to take sharper action later.
The Fed's 12-member policy committee voted 9-3 to hold rates steady, the first time there have been 3 dissenters in the same direction since 2016. Former New York Fed president and Bloomberg opinion columnist Bill Dudley says the reaction of markets to the Fed's decision and Fed Chair Kevin Warsh's press conference has increased pressure to tighten in September.
What's happened in financial markets over the last 72 hours or so basically increases the pressure on the Fed to act in September. If it's a jump ball in September, you almost need to tighten now because you have lost credibility over the last couple months.
Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley on Bloomberg Surveillance. Pressure on FIFA President Gianni Infantino is growing. His senior advisor, Carlos Cordeiro, has resigned, calling the plan to sell World Cup profits to a private equity a, quote, bad deal for football. He says he was not involved in what he called a secretive investment plan, which is now opposed by Europe, North America, and now Asia's soccer body, which has called on FIFA to undertake an urgent review of its governance and decision-making framework. Spain says more than half of the 60,000 people who illegally crossed the Spanish border have now left after a sudden arrival triggered chaos and a humanitarian crisis. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez blamed human smugglers for the crisis. President Trump, during today's cabinet meeting, called the migrant situation in Spain a catastrophe. That's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.